Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This is part 2 of launching our first EC2 instance. This is a lab and you'll need to log into the AWS console. Okay, so I'm in the AWS console. I'm just going to go back over to EC2 and we'll be able to see in our splash screen now we've got one running instance. Attached to it is our EBS volume, so our virtual hard disk is there. Then we've got our one key pair. This is the key that we created when we first created our EC2 instance. We can also see that there are two security groups now. So we created a new security group, our WebDMZ security group. And then the other one is the first security group that was created automatically when we first create our default VPC, and that's created automatically for us when we first create our AWS account. So go ahead and click on your one running instances here and you'll see our dashboard. And in here, if we just look down the bottom, you can make this bigger if you want. You can make it medium size or smaller by clicking those icons. So in here we've got our description. So we can see we've got our instance ID, the state that it's in, it's running, the type, so it's T2 micro, it's part of those Dr. McGift picks. This is our private DNS, so this is what we would use to connect to it internally. This is our private IP address. Then over here we have our public DNS, so if I just copy and paste this DNS address in, and if I open up a new tab in my browser and just paste this in and hit enter, again we'll see the Hello Cloud Gurus. So it automatically converts that DNS address to our public IP address, and I can navigate to my web server. Here I've got my public IP address. I have no elastic IPs assigned to it, and we'll cover what that is a little bit later. You can see what availability zone it's in, so EU-West-2A. In here we've got our security groups, and we'll look at that in the next lab. Scroll down, we can see our key pair name, so my EC2 key pair. And if we have a look down here, we've still got termination protection turned on. It says true. So if I was going to go ahead and try and terminate this, I go to Actions, Instance State, and then go down here. I can stop, I can reboot, or I can terminate my instance. I'm going to go ahead and hit terminate, and it says, are you sure you want to terminate these instances? And look, I can't click on yes, nothing happens. And the reason is it says here, these instances have termination protection and will not be terminated. Use the change termination protection option from the instances screen action to allow termination of these instances. So that's what I'm going to go do now. I'm going to go ahead over to Actions, go to Instance Settings, and go over to Change Termination Protection. And now you can go ahead and disable that, and this will allow you to terminate your instance. If you just hit the refresh button up here, you can see termination protection has changed to false. Before I do go in and terminate it, I just want to go ahead and have a look over here. So we've got status checks, and this checks the status of your instance. And there's two different types of status checks. These are really important to know the difference between these two going into the SysOps Administrator exam, not so much for the Solutions Architect or Developer Associate exam. But a system status check is basically, and if you hold your mouse over the little info button, it says that it's verifying that your instance is reachable. We test that we are able to get network packets to your instance. If this check fails, there may be an issue with the infrastructure hosting your instance, such as the power, networking, or software systems. So if you think about it, a system status check is actually just checking the underlying hypervisor, making sure the hypervisor is up, making sure the networking that gets to the hypervisor is up, whereas an instance status check is actually checking that you can get traffic to the operating system. So if an instance status check fails, you can reboot your instance, and that will mean that it will probably come up on another host, so it will come back up on another hypervisor. Whereas if a system status check fails, again, you could reboot it, or you can go in and terminate the instance if you're having any kind of issues. That's really a SysOps Administrator question, but it is good to know for troubleshooting anyway. In here we've got our monitoring, so we have just our basic monitoring. If you can remember, I told you in the last lecture that basic monitoring is every 5 minutes, so it's pinging our device every 5 minutes. We can turn on detailed monitoring, which is every 1 minute, so that's entirely up to you. Detailed monitoring will cost you a little bit extra. If we scroll down, we're going to have a lecture on CloudWatch later on, but you'll notice down here all our different metrics. So we can see in here CPU utilization. We can see a whole bunch of disk metrics. So we've got disk reads, disk read operations, disk writes, disk write operations, etc. We can see network operations, and then we can also see our status checks. And you do need to understand what default metrics come with CloudWatch going into the exams, but we will cover that off in the CloudWatch lecture of the course. And then finally in here we have our tags, which I showed you earlier. So the key value pairs, so our keys department, value is developer department, etc. And that's really it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this instance. So we just go ahead and go over to instance states terminate. Go ahead and terminate this instance. We will create many more instances, so don't worry about your little web page. We will make more of them. You can see here my SSH window being sad because I've just terminated the instance in which I was SSH'd into. And the very last thing I want to show you is how to do reserved instances. So we looked at, when we were creating our EC2 instance, we looked at how we could do on-demand, we looked at how we could do spot, and we looked at how we could do dedicated host. What we didn't look at is how to create reserved instances. So what you can do is just go back over to the EC2 dashboard. In here you can see under instances we've got our 4 different types, so you can test yourself on this every time you log into the dashboard, but we want to go over to reserved instances, and you can click here and go purchase reserved instances, and then you can go through and basically start searching for what you want to put into your cart. So we could have Linux, the tenancy is default, offering class, so just say any for this one. Let's say we want T2 micros. The term, let's go for a 3-year term, and the payment option is you can do upfront, partial upfront, all upfront, and all upfront will give you the greatest discount. Go ahead and hit search, and there we go. We can see that my upfront price here for for 3 years is going to be $156 and that's actually pretty good if you think about it. You can have your own little server in the cloud for $156. Works out roughly what, $52 a year, and that's it. That's all you have to pay. You pay it all up front, and then you'll have access to that for the next 3 years. Now, obviously, you don't probably want to do this, especially if you're just learning AWS. We're just going to use on-demand, and we're going to keep within free tier, but that's how you go ahead and purchase reserved instances. So the last thing I want to cover off is encrypted boot volumes. So if we just go back to launching a new instance, we go and click on Amazon Linux AMI, go ahead and just hit next for all your default options to make it a T2 micro. Just leave everything as is because we're not actually going to provision this. But right now you'll see storage, and in here we can add new volumes and we can encrypt the volumes by clicking this checkbox. But what we can't do is encrypt the root device volume of our standard AMIs. And you can encrypt root device volumes for your EC2 instances, but what you need to do is provision them first, create a copy or create an Amazon machine image of that EC2 instance, and while you're creating that copy, encrypt the root device volume. And we'll actually cover that off in a lab later on in this section of the course. But what's key to remember is by using the default root device volumes, you can't encrypt the default ones. You can't encrypt the ones that are provided by Amazon. Okay, so to summarize what we've learnt in this lab, we've actually learnt quite a lot. We learnt how to create an EC2 instance. We learnt how to use private and public keys, how to SSH into that EC2 instance. We also learnt about security groups and how to enable access on port 22, on port 80, on port 443, so on SSH, HTTP, and HTTPS. And then we actually went into our EC2 instance, we applied security patches to it, we then installed Apache, we then created our own little web page, we then turned Apache on and we're able to navigate to that little web page. We're able to look at the public DNS as well as the public IP addresses. We're able to look at tags. We covered an awful lot. Now, in terms of what you're going to need to know for your exams, these are the key points I want you to take away. So, termination protection. If you remember, termination protection is turned off by default. You must turn it on by clicking on that little checkbox. On an EBS-backed instance, the default action for the root EBS volume is to be deleted when the instance is terminated. What does that actually mean? Well, for your virtual machine, what happens when you go in and try and delete the virtual machine? Well, the virtual hard disk attached to that virtual machine is going to be deleted along with that virtual machine by default. Now you can turn that off by unchecking the box. Okay, so EBS root volumes, and this is a really confusing topic. So a root volume is just the volume or the virtual hard disk from which you are booting your operating system. So you're booting Windows, you're booting Linux. Can the EBS root volume be encrypted? Well, the answer is yes and no. The default AMIs that are provided to you by Amazon can't be encrypted. And when you spin up an image using a default AMI, you go to the encrypt option, and it's just no checkbox there. However, you can use third-party tools such as BitLocker for Windows, for example, to encrypt that root device volume, or you can create a copy of that Amazon machine image. So you can create your own AMI, and when you're creating that copy, you can actually encrypt the root device volume, and I'll show you how to do that in a lab that's coming up in the next section of the course. So you're going to get a couple of scenario-based questions, and you really have to read them carefully, and it will ask you around whether or not you can encrypt a root device volume. Of course, you can always encrypt a root device volume using third-party software, but by default you cannot encrypt the Amazon default AMI's root device volumes, but you can do it if you create a copy of them and then you encrypt the copy, and I'll show you how to do that in a lab. And then finally, additional volumes can definitely be encrypted. There's a little checkbox there that you can check, and then you can go in and encrypt that. So that's it for this lecture, guys. Hopefully that summarizes everything. You have, even though it was quite a long lecture for just spinning up an EC2 instance, you've learned an awful lot. You've learned how to provision an EC2 instance. You've learned how to attach an EBS volume to it. You've learned all about security groups, how to open up ports on there. You've learned all about SSHing into those EC2 instances, how to install operating system updates, how to install Apache, how to create a little web page, how to navigate to that little web page after starting the Apache service. So you have learned an awful lot. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at security groups in a fair bit more detail. So if you've got the time, join me in the next lecture. Thank you.